Hey, welcome everybody. My name is Jim Ryan. I'm the Director of Research and Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today for an event to discuss the very exciting World Cup that's happening in Qatar these past few weeks. And hopefully this serves as a nice appetizer for the exciting match happening today at 2 o'clock here in the East between France and Morocco. We couldn't have timed this better, I think. Before we get started, I also want to, this is a special event in some ways because we are partnering today with the fantastic Middle East Reporting and Information Project, one of the smartest publications for analysis on the Middle East going back over 50 years now. And we're lucky to have with us some of the authors from their recent issue on the World Cup. And I want to turn it over just briefly to Mandy Turk, their executive director, to say a brief word about MERIP before we get started. Mandy, take it away.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to the entire Foreign Policy Research Institute team for partnering with MERIP on this exciting event. MERIP is the Middle East Research and Information Project, and as Jim said, we have been publishing a critical alternative lens on the Middle East since 1971, so 52 years. Our entire website is open access, free of charge to anyone, and that includes some of our archival material from all that time. So you can find really deeply nuanced, heavily researched, unique perspectives on pretty much every Middle Eastern issue for the last half century. I've included all of our information and ways to get to our content into the chat. Please follow along, sign up for our email newsletter, follow us on social media so you can continue to see our content. And I've also included the link to our most recent issue from which this panel is drawn, Football, Passions, and Politics. So we have really done a deep dive into the issues surrounding this World Cup, which you'll get a sample of today with our excellent participants. So with that, just another thank you to everyone, and I'll turn it.
All right, thank you so much, Mandy. And so I'm going to introduce our speakers right off the top, and then we'll dive into the discussion. We're going to have a discussion about several of the key issues that are surrounding the World Cup and that were addressed in the recent issue by the authors that we have present here today for about 30 or 40 minutes before we open things up to audience Q&A. So to introduce our speakers today, we have with us Dr. Jafar Alul. Jafar is a postdoctoral research fellow in migration sociology at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He's joining us today from Brussels. He's also a visiting scholar in residence at Georgetown University in Qatar. He was just returned from Qatar. He's been on the ground for most of the World Cup so far, is headed back there soon. So we're really interested to hear about some more recent developments that he's been observing on the ground over the last few weeks. We also have Natasha Iskander, who is the James Weldon Johnson Professor of Urban Planning and Public Policy at New York University's Wagner School of Public Service. She's also the author of an award-winning new book entitled Does Skill Make Us Human? Migrant Workers in 21st Century Qatar and Beyond. And lastly, we have joining us from Singapore, Lavanya Kathiravelu. Lavanya is an associate professor in the School of Social Sciences at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. And they're all authors in this new special issue from MERIP. I want to thank you all for joining us today. It's a really fantastic piece of work. Thank you again for writing these things, and I send people to MERIP. I can't recommend it enough. Just to get us started, I want to start off with Jafar and Lavanya. They co-authored a piece on citizenship and belonging in Qatar in advance of the World Cup, and I want to ask them, how visa regimes and reforms that were introduced after 2021 elections, very groundbreaking, path-breaking elections in Qatar last year in 2021, how have these new reforms and regimes impacted the experience of attendees at the World Cup? Have there been any resulting circumstances that have created new and interesting issues for Qatar's relationship with its neighbors, the Arab world, the rest of the world at large? I know these were big themes coming into the development of the World Cup since the bid, but a lot has changed in the last year. So I want to start with Jafar and then Lavanya, just to ask you what's happened in the last maybe 6 months that's really changed the way Qatar is relating to people arriving in Qatar for the World Cup and what that might mean for their regional relations.
Okay, thank you very much, James, for this nice introduction. So first of all, maybe to kick it off, it's important to contextualize and mention that this is basically the first FIFA World Cup ever hosted in the Arab world, in the Middle East, and also in the quote-unquote Muslim world. So this in and by itself is a large event with great significance. And it's only the second one that has been hosted so far in Asia, the former being the one in Japan together with South Korea. So when you are on the ground in Qatar, you straight away feel this sense of unicum, a really unique experience taking place on the ground, in which many people take a lot of pride. And I would say a lot of people from the region, from the GCC, from the Arab world present on the ground that take a lot of pride in it. And also a lot of the established middle classes in the region. And these are also a lot of people with migration heritage from the Indian subcontinent, of course, people with Pakistani, Indian origin, etc. So I just wanted to sort of put that out there as a starter. What has changed, which was significant prior to the World Cup? So in the immediate lead up, it was quite interesting that overnight Qatar sort of introduced a new visa scheme that would apply to all visitors, whether you coming in for business, for other purposes, you would have to apply for a so-called Haya visa. And some of the regulations tied into this Haya visa, it was mainly for the FIFA World Cup fans, but some of the regulations tied into it had a restrictive character, being that all of a sudden only fans that would get hold of a ticket were actually permitted in. And it's important to say that this is also quite extraordinary. Is the first time that a host of such an event disallowed basically auxiliary fans to come in, so the regular crowds that would join with a group of friends in a pub or a cafe to watch the games and sort of just enjoy the event on the ground. So there were some concerns there that, in a way, this is also a very classist measure being taken, but these were some of the important, I think, restrictions, and it also made things harder to get in, because the bureaucratic process for getting in involved a lot more work, and this led, in general, I would say, to a lot lesser numbers coming in. And I do think this isn't a coincidence. It was sort of a last-ditch measure Qatar apparently took, which is quite extraordinary. You would think that, all the effort being put into the World Cup, that they would sort of want to celebrate it, but you saw this tendency to sort of clamp down last minute, to downgrade the numbers coming in. And I think this relates very much to a concern that they had that things might get out of hand and that they would not have the infrastructure in general, also the policing infrastructure, etc., to deal and manage with these crowds. But I think these were some of the interesting developments. You also asked about dynamics in relation to the region. I do think the tournament in the end created a slight rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. You had Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman sitting at the front row, 2 seats to the right of the Qatari Emir, which was a significant sign of a rapprochement after the 2017 blockade. In general, also in the wider world, you had this. I mean, everybody knows now about the general contentions, especially from the West, sort of the moral outrage about Qatar, human rights, and in relation especially to this mega event. But while this was ongoing, and especially in Europe, you had a lot of negative media reporting. You had the Ukraine war, Russia basically invading, and Europe's energy security in jeopardy. So while you had this major criticism coming from Western countries, You also saw a scramble, heads of European state basically flying into Qatar, but also the UAE, Saudi Arabia, to secure new energy contracts. So you had this very strange mix of events coming together. And I do think they're important in the background to consider. But I'll pass the word on to Lavanya, might want to follow up.
Sure. Thank you so much for that, Hussein. And you point up actually what I think is an interesting contradiction about the World Cup as a project in Qatar, that at one level, bringing the World Cup to Qatar was about welcoming the rest of the world into Qatar, giving a window into Qatar for the rest of the world, building relationships both regionally and around the world. And at the same time, in the run-up, there's all these concerns about how to maintain order, how to police, how to restrict and clamp down on the world actually coming to Qatar. And so it's sort of welcoming and restrictive at the same time, which I think is a really interesting tension for sure. Lavanya, I wanted to pass it to you to sort of ask a little bit more about that tension, how you've seen it, especially being based in Southeast Europe or Southeast Asia, where Qatar's regional politics, I think, is maybe not so obvious to our audience and people in the West.
Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity. And I think, adding to what Jafar said, on one hand, there were these restrictions in terms of the hayakat that were imposed, but in some ways that was also an equalizing force, because it then meant that everyone had to apply for this hayakat. I mean, of course, it means that you had to be able to afford a ticket to the match, but you were allowed to gain entry to Qatar not based on existing visa restrictions that allowed certain visa holders or certain nationalities to come in with visa on arrival and others to have to apply for a visa in order to enter into Qatar. So I think in one way we can see it as restrictive, but on the other hand, as also imposing a more egalitarian admissions policy. And for a lot of people, I mean, from parts of the Arab world, but also the African continent and from Asia as well, the proximity of Qatar meant that this was a World Cup that they felt they could participate in far more closely. Maybe not in terms of time zone so much, but more in terms of accessibility. So I have many friends, colleagues who went for the World Cup who are still there, more than, and far larger numbers than would go for any World Cup stage in Europe. And also because of the visa issues, people of South Asian origin, often with African nationalities and passports, they often face difficulties entering countries in Europe when they host the World Cup. But this is not so much the case, I think, with Qatar. So in that sense, not just because of the geographical region, but also because of these visa regulations, it's been more welcoming in that sense for people from other parts of the world, I think. And that adds to this sense of it being a World Cup that is not really European, but a World Cup for other parts of the world, right? And I think especially for the South Asians, who are the majority of the population in many Gulf countries, including UAE, as well as in Qatar, I think for them, this is really also a opportunity to be part of this World Cup, right? Because South Asia is also a big sports loving area. I mean, cricket, of course, but soccer as well, even though its team itself maybe not part of it, but a lot of these we see a lot of South Asians as well, kind of feeling a sense of this is our home, right? This part of the world is our home. We've lived there. In our article, we talk about second generation expats. A lot of them who are South Asian from Pakistan or from India. And for them, this was also their World Cup in many ways, right? And the ways they talk about this place being their home and hosting this World Cup was also very important to them. So I think we should also, see it on those terms, right? And from this part of the world, that was really important, I think.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for that. Jafar, if you wanted to add on something there,
maybe a small note. I think what Lavanya actually mentioned is very important. When I arrived, I also noticed this very quickly, that one, there weren't that many European soccer fans there on the ground, and on the one hand, it might relate to the season. This is a winter season. There's less holiday. There is less animo apparently. and it's also quite an expensive country. But I've also noticed that the reason that many people didn't go was precisely because they're actually used to traveling in very privileged visa regimes. So all this extra hassle, as they perceived it, extra hassle was something new. So also then when you arrive on the ground, you notice that it is a big party, and it is a big party for other people and for regional people who also honestly didn't very much care about the lack of European soccer fans, or also the criticism. So I do think that that's an important feature to mention. Yes.
Yeah, it is maybe difficult to perceive watching the games from the States, but it makes a lot of sense that this is in many ways a Global South World Cup. And who knows? I mean, if Morocco pulls it out today, we might get a Global South final after Argentina won yesterday. Natasha, I wanted to turn to you, and I mean, your work is absolutely brilliant on this stuff, and critical in so many important ways. If I can crib note the argument of your book, what you investigate is sort of the role that the idea of skill plays in how we talk about the development of Qatar and the migrant workers who help build all of these stadiums, do all of this development. I'm sorry. Basically what I'd like to ask you is, how is this system, over the years that you've been observing it, the kafala system that people are hearing about, how has the system changed? How has the welcoming of different types of people into Qatar, the increased attention from the West and other places on the development around the World Cup, has this had an influence or an impact on the system that's been in place for many decades now of migrant labor? What are the prospects for future changes that might happen after the World Cup?
Thank you, Jim, for those great questions. And thank you for inviting me to this panel with Jafar and Lavanya, whose work I so admire. I want to say that this is a cup for the Global South, definitely. And it's like, it deserves the celebratory halo it has received for that. But it's not a World Cup for everyone in the Global South. And I think that that is a critical distinction. It is a World Cup for the elites of the Global South. It is not a World Cup for the Global South workers who have built the World Cup. And I say that wanting to be really specific. It is not a World Cup for them in the sense of being able to attend the games. It is a World Cup for them in the sense of the pride and accomplishment they should feel in what they have built for all of us. Right, so Qatar's tagline here for this World Cup is expect amazing. It has delivered on that, absolutely. The fact that Qatar went from a country that had basically no stadia to a country that has and not just 8 beautiful stadia, but an entire infrastructure, and quadrupled its urban footprint in 10 years with a port and a new airport and a new transportation system and a new, the list goes on. That is absolutely due to the, I mean, maybe this is an overstatement, but I actually don't think it is, the kind of heroism, bravery, and commitment of the workers who built this cup. And their contribution, I think, is somewhat missing in all of the debates, whether it is the debates, or whether it is the portrayal of them as exploited, or whether it is kind of their erasure from the story altogether. Their contribution in terms of their skill development, their creativity, their solidarity, their human effort, their agency, their imagination, all of that somehow has tended to get elided from a debate that is really about for or against Qatar. So I think it's important to center that. About the reforms. So I'll say 2 things about the reforms. Qatar has, kind of by global standards, initiated a reform process that is incredibly rapid and consequential on paper. I don't think it would have done so without the attention that the World Cup drew to Qatar in the preparatory decade. I don't think that the conditions of work for migrant workers was anywhere really on the political radar in Qatar in any significant way. And to some extent, I think it remains off the political radar. I mean, Nasser al-Khater's comments about kind of death being a part of life is an expression, I think, of a broader disregard for migrant workers. Still, the reforms that Qatar has initiated have been really consequential and significant. So much so that Qatar went in the short span of a decade from a regulatory system, which actually reached its form when the World Cup was awarded just in 2009, went from a system that was tantamount to a formal system of labor bondage specified by law to a system for temporary workers, which is more protective than most systems around the world, including the system in the US. So Qatar's laws regarding migrant workers are more protective than the H2A, H2B, H1B visa systems we have in the US on paper. What that means in practice is a more complicated story. And that is because laws do not dictate working conditions, industry structures do. And the power dynamics that run through those industry structures do. And there are several factors that work against the same kind of rapid change that you can dictate in legal change, not the least of which is, in fact, the enormous time pressure of delivering the World Cup by a hard deadline of November 18, 2022. That enormous time pressure really exacerbated some of the exploitative practices and power dynamics that ran through the industry structure and systems of production. I can go into more detail, but I think that's just the general story. I'll say one final thing, and then I'll turn it over to the rest of us. But I think what this World Cup has done, if there is a positive outcome of a lot of the debate around labor conditions, is that I think it has created the possibility for interpolating us as a global community to think about labor conditions for migrant workers everywhere. And for me, the most positive outcome from this World Cup is the statement by the ILO that they will be partnering with FIFA going forward to think about how to evaluate working conditions associated with the World Cup for future cups and how to work toward positive reform, which means that if all goes as well as it could possibly, we can have these same conversations about working conditions in the US, in Mexico, and in Canada for the next round.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the spotlight really turns, to this side of the Atlantic, after the final next week, I would think in that regard. And, I think it's a perfect segue into what I wanted to ask next is, I think a lot of us who have been following the Middle East, and particularly this Qatar World Cup bid for a very long time, have become sort of really familiar with all of the power dynamics, the political problems, the contradictions, sort of embedded in the project of the Qatar World Cup and Qatari politics and Gulf politics more broadly. And then all of a sudden, in the lead up to the World Cup, we have, all of these sort of hoary old narratives, sort of on both sides, that we've almost gotten past contending with. But I since we have the three of you here, I wanted to ask, how do you all kind of approach the kind of discourse that we have about this World Cup that says, like, on the one hand, they never should have had a bid, it's horrendously corrupt, they're exploitative, and it's slave labor, I want to boycott, etc. And then on the other hand, the sort of kind of canned defense that you often get, which is like, were you guys saying this stuff about Russia? Were you guys saying this stuff about China when they hosted the Olympics? You know, and I think, you know, Natasha, your last point kind of shows the difference there in some sense, is that, you know, the welcoming, or the fact that Qatar asked for this, you know, in a lot of ways, they asked for this scrutiny, they asked for this pressure in a way that maybe Russia and China didn't. And the potential there for, you know, sort of longer lasting reform might be part of this answer. But I want to turn first to Jafar. You know, how have you dealt with these narratives, especially since you've been on the ground in Qatar very recently?
Well, thank you. I don't know what's happening. Sorry, I'm sorry. So what I was going to say, yeah. So the contending narratives, I do think it's a fine line to sort of thread. But if you look at the narratives in general, you know, it's super contending, and in a way, it's almost civilizational, right? But I do think, as Natasha said, we can be critical but nuanced at the same time. And I do think that there have been significant reforms in relation to kafala, but a lot of it is also overstated and remains fact on paper, but not on the ground. And with that, I just want to substantiate. I don't think Qatar is this absolute dystopia that people portray it to be. That's one thing. It's not as if every worker at all is a bonded worker, but we have to talk specific. I think in certain industries, indeed, practices of passport confiscation are still ongoing, and I have noticed this on the ground, talking to some of the workers that popped into my fan village to watch the game, basically, who would say that, you know, we make good money. We go home once in 2 years, which is sort of the average for blue collar workers on the ground. But then when they mention their passport being confiscated, still they would cringe. You know, you would actually see it. So I do think this is an important theme that needs to be discussed. That said, I also think that not all Qataris are really aware of what's going on. Sometimes they would say, yeah, I think kafala has been abolished, or I'm not really sure. So you really have to look into the specifics, which groups still suffer which kind of problems, and you really have to look into the nitty-gritty to have an actual discussion about what's going on. I do think that some of the media attention was also overblown. You know, you would have media outlets, especially in the West, talking, for instance, about fake fans, and then they would say, "Look at all these Indians, you know, dressed up as Argentinians. They must have been paid for, and look how the whole World Cup is rigged." But then you would see that this is really sort of a neo-colonial way of reporting, because I mean, it's totally discards the reality that the heartbeat of these cities is basically South Asian. You have a whole middle class of South Asians who are pretty invested in sports cultures also, especially the ones from Kerala, which have a historical tradition of supporting Latin American countries, as India has not been doing very well in the FIFA World Cup for decades now. So, you know, to just portray all these masses as if they were paid for is really sort of a neo-colonial and Orientalist trope, I would say. I'll leave it there.
Lavanya, I want to pick up on what Jafar just left us with, which is that, you know, these groups that are what you were saying earlier about what this World Cup means to the global South, and particularly to South Asia. You know, I think a lot of people, when they first heard that Qatar won this World Cup bid, you know, the reaction was, they have no football culture. They have, no infrastructure for this. You know, yes, it's an Arab country, but like, why this one? And I mean, at some level, you know, I think they're missing in that narrative, the ability of Qatar, despite all of this exploitation, to actually host this might have been more than some other Arab countries, and B, the historical ties between the Gulf and South Asia, are actually much stronger and deeper than I think people understand on first blush. So, to this question of like how to deal with these contending narratives, what is that perspective sort of, how's your perspective help shift that narrative a little bit?
Yeah, thanks for that. And I mean, I don't know if my perspective shifts the narrative, but I think the way I approach it, and I want to frame it, is really about, Qatar trying to place itself as a global city on the world map, right? Just as Dubai has, and Qatar is now doing, right? Dubai is on the world map. Everyone knows it's a really desirable destination for expatriates. And Qatar is now placing itself on the world map. And I think the criticisms leveled against Qatar on labor rights issues are also being felt regionally, because this system of dependence on low-wage migrant labor is not specific to Qatar, right? We know, of course, there's been criticism in the UAE about this, but also other Gulf states. And of course, in Singapore as well, right? We have a very high dependence on low-wage migrant labor as well. But so I think this is a kind of perhaps tension that has reverberations beyond Qatar itself. But I really see it as, Qatar wanting to place itself on a world stage, be taken seriously as a destination. And like Dubai, Dubai too is known for infrastructure building, right? It's the Palm Islands, the Burj Khalifa. So this kind of infrastructure building seems to be a way for it to put itself on the world stage. And I think it's done that over 10 years or 12 years with this building the infrastructure for the World Cup. And of course, Qatar, but the rest of the region will continue, I think, to hold a lot of these international events in years to come, because now it's seen as, okay, things have worked so well in Qatar. Maybe this is a region we need to consider seriously for other global events, right? The other thing in relation to South Asia that I want to talk about was, so as Natasha mentioned, it's a very complex process, right? This labor migration process, and it also involves the Indian states or the sending states. Right. And what hasn't been talked about at all in these, more journalistic pieces, of course, on the World Cup, is the role of the Indian state in the regulation of this migration. We know, for instance, that there are many levels of agents, sub-agents that regulate this migration process. And a lot of the exploitative conditions of debt, for instance, come from the sending state region, right? Yet because, India is seen as not as wealthy a country, and it would kind of mess up this narrative of Indians as victims. And as Jafar pointed out, there's lots of elite, and as Natasha pointed out, elite middle class Indians as well. But the role of the Indian state is not talked about in this complication as well. So I think there's a lot more room for nuance, but we don't always get it.
No, that's absolutely right. I'm going to ask Natasha a question, and then actually after that, I want to provide an opportunity for our audience to ask questions. And since we're doing this in a meeting, anyone in the audience ought to be able to raise their hand if they want to ask their question verbally. We'll be able to unmute you once you do that. You're also more than welcome to submit a question via the chat. And if you prefer to do so anonymously, you can send one in a direct message to me. Natasha, I, sort of pulling on this theme or this thread of contending narratives, and, sort of seeing the region from the perspective of this event and Qatar, I sort of wanted to ask about, the mega project politics, in a certain sense, that extend to the Gulf, to Dubai, to extend to Saudi, and even extend to Gulf sponsorship of mega projects elsewhere in the region.
Yeah.
I think I joked about this on Twitter that Mohammed bin Salman was so excited that Saudi Arabia won a game in the World Cup that he gave $5 billion to Turkey, to help cover its foreign debt problems. So it's really, I think, indicative of a reordering that's happening with sort of across the region, and obviously the migrant labor needed to build these things is a diplomatic tool in that sense. So I wanted to ask you how you see the narrative changing in the region based on your observations and research.
And I think what's really fascinating about this World Cup is that it is kind of the manifestation of a modernist imaginary. And what I mean by that is that at the heart of modernism isn't just an aesthetic, there's a method to it. So modernism creates citizens by first creating the city, right? It creates hierarchies, it creates ways of living, it creates subjectivities by first building the built environment and then asking people to kind of comply with that built environment. And I think in the Gulf, there's the added layer of you can then import the residents. So you don't even have to worry about kind of raising parts of the city to rebuild. You can just, as one consultant put it, it's like sketching on the sand. I mean, that's, its own kind of narrative thing. But I think that there is something about the use of these mega projects as a kind of material politics, and as a way of institutionalizing in cement and glass and steel certain kinds of hierarchies and subjectivities, right? So for me, one of the really interesting developments in Qatar is Lusail, which is, a smart city. It's, at the cutting technological edge, it's at the cutting design edge. It is meant to be climate controlled. It is meant to be green. It is like green in terms of green building. And yet in the zoning for Lusail, there is definitely a social hierarchy. There is the area zoned for the residents and the area zoned for the workers who will be providing services to the residents. I think those kind of, high modernist approaches to domestic and international politics are here one of the main threads that really hasn't been picked up on in any of the coverage. I will say, right, that these modernist politics rely on a labor politics that deserves more attention. So, one of the helpful points that Jafar made is that there isn't an attention to the nitty-gritty of these labor politics. And that, in Qatar, basically, everyone is covered by all foreign workers, from the professional to, the street sweeper, are covered by the same regulatory structure. I mean, there are some minor distinctions, but overall, all foreign workers are covered by the same structure. And certainly the patterns of exploitation differ by occupation, by wealth status, although I have to say that non-payment of wages is pretty chronic throughout. I think what is missing is an attention to what produces these conditions. And that, I think, we can absolutely lay at the feet of the Qataris. Why? Because they have made research on these questions very difficult. Research access is really complicated. I mean, the fact that I am like one of the only researchers who's had extended research on construction sites, that's not helpful. It shouldn't, what you should have is many, so that you can identify what are the problematic industry structures and how do we unwind them. I think what has happened is that the solutions have been, as a result of a lack of attention to the nitty-gritty, pro forma, solutions on paper, solutions that don't actually work very well in practice. So back to close the thought on your earlier question, if we are thinking about what these mega politics mean, we also, mega construction politics mean, mega development politics mean, whether in Qatar or in Cairo, or right, we also need to be thinking about paying more close attention to the kind of labor politics they allow and expand upon or solidify. And that requires a careful attention to industry dynamics, from the construction all the way through like finance and international design and climate politics and so on and so forth. Right, we do actually need to pay attention to how these structures of power play out on the ground in these mega development politics.
I think I couldn't agree with you more. I certainly am sensitive, I think, to the ways that this gets elided or not talked about, even in, the geopolitical events that people do pay attention to, like, conflict in Syria. There is a labor politics to that as well. I mean, you talk about Turkey's mega projects are by and large built and serviced by Syrian refugees. How much does he really want to send people back? Jafar, I just want to notice, you say once again, folks are welcome to raise their hand. If you hit the reactions button, you can raise your hand and ask a question to our panelists. We have about 15 or 20 minutes left in our session here. And likewise, if you want to pop a question into the chat at any time, I'm happy to read it off. You could send it to everyone in the chat, or you can send it to me as a direct message. Sort of expanding our scope sort of out more globally, Jafar, I wanted to ask you about a story that recently came out about a corruption scandal that has involved the Qataris in the EU. That's kind of come out over the last couple of weeks. Do you have any initial sort of reaction to that? And can you tell our audience a little bit more about what may be going on there?
Yeah, so early last week it came out, or media reported at least, on the fact that there's a criminal prosecution going on now, investigation about potential briberies in the European Parliament, and one of the vice presidents of the European Parliament being implicated. And apparently there were some home searches and quote unquote bags of money were found for PR purposes, apparently. The investigation is still ongoing, but people have been arrested. People are in custody. So there are concerns now. And this is actually about lobbying. But that said, this institution, the European Parliament, is infamous for being approached by lobbyists. And this is also maybe a point to raise, is that however you want to implicate Qatar in these matters, and I'm sure the judiciary will do its work and things will be demonstrated, but it's the same for FIFA. We have to know that these Western counterparts are, often also have a tradition of corruption and of being implicated in this sort of scheme. So there's always two sides of the coin. So I just wanted to mention that very briefly. And maybe tying into the last question, what I find very interesting, having studied the region a bit in general, but also the wider Middle East, is that, I mean, for a long time, you had this sort of Khaliji nationalism in the making, but now also what you have more recent even is specifically Qatari nationalism, specifically Emirati nationalism, as distinct from Saudi nationalism, which is something that is not that easy to pull off, especially in the Arabian Peninsula, with so much family connections, with borders that used to be very porous up until recently, prior to the blockade. One other thing that I want to mention very briefly is that, there is this general paradox when you look at the World Cup, and also issues that Natasha has mentioned about hyperdevelopment, basically overnight, the material infrastructure being built. But the research that Lavanya and I are doing, you also see that there is a segment of the resident population, the quote unquote migrants, that are the operationals, right? The Arabs, the people of South Asian origin, who are really invested in the development of the country as technical professional workers, or people with a lot of finances and have basically really made it their home. But we see also that even for them, these very loyal residents, very privileged residents, Qatar is also pushing some of them out. And this might seem like a paradox, right? Because you're engaged in this Vision 2030 project, but then at the same time, you're pushing out a critical segment of your human capital. So we also have to ask ourselves, how come? Why? What is the logic behind it? And this also has to do with the fact that these states are being built literally, but also you have the making of a national bourgeoisie who, controls the economy, is not per se local, native as people would want to imagine it. And you see that the state itself is concerned about that, because historically it's also a process where these are powerful groups that compete for political power potentially. So you have all these questions coming up. Also, what does it mean to be a citizen if you cannot vote? What does the social contract imply, et cetera, et cetera? So these are all open questions, more of a Pandora's box that is sort of unpacking as we speak. So if you're on the ground in Qatar and you understand these dynamics, it's actually quite a fascinating place to move around it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thanks for that. I wanted to give Lavanya a chance to follow up on that question and those points in terms of both Qatar's more global reach and also the sort of construction of Qatari nationalism there. Go ahead, Lavanya.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think following up from what Jafar said, I think we see this emergence of nationalism in the World Cup also through, I guess, the supporting of certain discourses or ideas, ideologies, and then the rejection or not public acceptance of others, right? So we see, for instance, during the World Cup, there's a lot of support for Palestine, right? So a lot of people have talked about how this World Cup is really a win for Palestine, because that kind of support has been, not discouraged, right? That's been on, despite a lot of Gulf states normalizing relations with Israel. On the ground, they've allowed this kind of public support of Palestine, while not really allowed people who are supporting the protests in Iran to be active, to allowed into stadiums when they were wearing T-shirts, for example, in support of that. And also, of course, the LGBTQI, the armbands, there hasn't been public support of that. So I think this is also part of the nation building project of trying to define, what we stand for, what we will support, and what we won't, or what we will tolerate. Perhaps we're not going to not allow people in because of their sexuality, but we're not going to support this, right? And this is also part of a nation state trying to define, I think, who it is. And this may not necessarily be what people on the ground want, or citizens, but this is in some ways, a kind of, I think, tussle or a negotiation that's happening between what local Qataris or residents want in terms of, what rights or what ideologies that they want to support, and what the state thinks should happen, right? And given the kind of authoritarian nature of a lot of these regimes, I think this is also probably, it's very hard to understand, what lies where, right? And we need more research to find that out, I think.
For sure.
Yeah.
I mean, as scholars of nationalism know that even in a heavily authoritarian contexts, nationalism as an idea, as an ideology, doesn't just spring out of a box fully formed, right? It's part of a sorting out process with power players and power struggles, different actors, domestically, regionally, nationally, et cetera. And it is, I agree, completely fascinating to see this get sorted out in a place like Qatar, and honestly getting sorted out other places because of the World Cup. And I kind of want to ask Natasha this. Morocco, who's going to be playing in a couple of hours, is a member of the Abraham Accords, does have a deal with Israel, and yet their fans, their players are waving Palestinian flags. Sort of on the other side of that, we had a piece run last week by Lior Sternfeld on that mentioned how Israelis have been very supportive of the protests in Iran, very supportive, and had very high opinions of the Iranian team in the World Cup, despite the fact that they might think very differently about Arab players for their own national team were they as part of the World Cup. So a lot of the politics of support for different nations and teams in this World Cup has also contributed to this sort of sorting out process. And I'm wondering, Natasha, how you've observed that as things have gone on.
I think James, you pull out a lot of the really important political tensions and threads, and the divide between a government that will sign on to the Abraham Accords and how it manages national sentiment vis-a-vis Palestine. I think there's also an additional layer here of what, I'm so excited for the game this afternoon, I can barely contain myself. But I think what will be also interesting there is the fact that many of the players on the French team are the product of these, colonial migration histories, in some ways, the product of some of the very same labor dynamics we've been talking about, and what that means, and what that means in terms of nation building, national forms of assertion of national identities. And I think, for me, what is interesting, in addition to the regional politics, is to see how the regional politics are playing out in Paris, where, the Parisian government has dispatched, I don't know how many police to control whatever reaction happens to today's game. Mm-hmm. I think it's really been such a fascinating node of all of these political threads coming together at this one global event. And I have to say, I'm not sure whether my sensitivity to this particular event is heightened because of my own work, but I don't remember this kind of charge and these multiple political threads attaching at prior World Cups. Mm-hmm. And this may be just, my memory, but I actually think that it may be more than that, that mm-hmm. there are multiple threads attaching to this cup. Mm-hmm. And to some extent, this may be the product of very Orientalist media coverage. And I think, if there is anything positive to be drawn from what has been, frankly, very Orientalist media coverage, is the fact that these conversations have also surfaced, mm-hmm. have surfaced in equal and perhaps even greater measure. Mm-hmm. And that these dynamics that were subsumed are coming to the fore. I mean, the only parallel that I can think of is the 1998 World Cup, where France realized that it wasn't white. When the French won and the team was all immigrant, either immigrants or kids of immigrants. Mm-hmm. I think that this cup, for whatever reason, is having kind of a foundational, it's generating a foundational shift in some of the kinds of debates that we are having, and making explicit some of the kind of anti-Arab Orientalist tropes that are used to think about the region.
Mm-hmm. I mean, part of the beauty of soccer and the World Cup, if I can put it this way, is that it actually makes it easier to talk about these things sometimes than when talking about them in a different context. So I completely agree with you. We have a time for maybe one or two questions from the audience. I want to ask Dr. Laid Zaglami to unmute themselves. You might be able to turn on your camera. Go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you, James. This is Laid from Algiers. Well, I'm happy that I've been listening to this webinar. Just a point of view from the global south, as you may see. I think so far, people here in Algeria, for instance, they are just enjoying the game, the beauty of the game. And tonight, we are still squeezed between France and Morocco. They don't bother about what happened for the last couple of years, or there is violation of labor, this or that. But I understand that for Qatar, its branding, its image worldwide, and it has already done it through Jazeera, English, Jazeera, Arabic. But I think this is to say how a small country, about 2 million population, with good management, can be able to organize such a world event. Of course, now Qatar is using it at soft power. We don't have to forget that. More than that, diplomacy, sport diplomacy. And I think overall, it's one way or the other to get to some kind of understanding and mutual understanding between the global north and the global south, if I may say so. This is in the end of the day, we want to get this kind to bridge these things between what we call developed countries, civilized country, and developing countries. And this is the ultimate aim. In the end of the day, football has been a fiesta for all over the world, regardless of culture, regardless of race, and so forth. I am so happy that now at least the other part of the world realize that there is a small country called Qatar with its own specific values of Islam and Arabs. And of course, it's their right to organize, and they have so far done it perfectly, elegantly, and without any hurts. And more than that, with the respect of their own values and our religion. And thank you so much, James, for giving me this opportunity to voice my view.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I don't know if one of our panelists want to jump off of anything there. Jafar, please.
Yeah, it was noticeable when I was on the ground in Qatar how much the Qataris themselves also emphasized that this was really for Kull al-Arab, for al-Alam al-Arabi. So it is significant in the sense that it also, this event cultivates sort of an alternative future for many people that are there, that originate from countries like Libya, Syria, Iraq, where the situation is, to be frank, very depressing. So they say also often this is sort of a sliver of hope, in the sense that, you know, an alternative future for the wider region may be possible. So that's interesting to bear in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I mean, I couldn't be happier to be sitting here in New York and having this conversation with Algeria, with Brussels, with Singapore, and all the folks here who have joined us from all over the world. We're just about at time, so I just want to very quickly extend one more thank you to Jafar, Natasha, Lavanya for joining us today. Lavanya, I know it's quite late where you are. Thank you again for staying up for us. I also want to thank our donors, our members, our supporters, our board of trustees at FPRI. We could not do this stuff without you. Likewise, on MERIP's behalf, you know, for those of you who are part of our FPRI audience, please make your way to their website, check out the issue, throw them some of your support as well. They are also a member and donor supported organization who do just absolutely fantastic work. So once again, thank everyone for being here. If you're watching on YouTube a little bit later, it's great to have you there as well. And, you know, we'll see you again very, very soon. Thank you guys so much.